Let's talk about the biggest string instrument. This is Open Mind Alexander technique. I'm Jess. Today we're digging into double bass, stand-up bass, upright bass, whatever you'd like to call it. It goes by lots of names. It's the huge one. And it's really interesting to look at what are the mechanics and challenges and suggestions that we can take for bass players from Alexander technique. So, one of the first things to think about is this object. So this is the kind of stool that a lot of bass players will use. This is one that I coincidentally already have, so I brought it in so that I could use it with bass players. You would think that a lot of bass players would be physically larger people, but I have found this is simply not the case, and I don't know why. The first chair bassist here at the Lamont School of Music right now is a woman who is shorter than I am. I've also worked with a jazz bassist, a grad student. He was a little taller than me, but not by much. And they're dealing with these unbelievably massive instruments. And if you've ever tried to actually press down the string on a upright bass, oh my God, it's hard. It does not feel like pressing down the string of other smaller string instruments. Even like guitar or electric bass, it's way harder and there's way more space between the string and the neck of the instrument. So there's some big movement there and it's hard to press down. So bass is not on the list of instruments that I would be able to play. I'm hypermobile, especially in my hands, and the amount of hand tension that it takes to play this thing, I would have joint issues with if I were to attempt that. So more power to you guys playing bass. Man, y'all are nuts. It's a really cool instrument. So some of the things that come up with it, first of all, is looking at the relationship between you and the stool. Not everyone plays with a stool. Some people prefer to play standing, and there's generally not a ton of height difference between them, which is kind of the whole point. We are going to talk about this from both the classical and the jazz worlds. So the first thing to look at, and the reason I've got a shoe here, it can be really helpful to wear shoes with this kind of wooden stool that have some sort of a heel to them. It doesn't have to be a crazy tall heel, although we'll talk about in a second why that can be helpful. Even just the heel that is on like men's dress shoes is enough that you can kind of hook that onto the rung of the legs of the stool here. A lot of these stools will have different height on one side versus the other of these side rungs, and so you can always rotate this in different ways depending on what you need. Another thing I see a lot of bassists doing that I think is a wonderful idea is having one foot up on the rung of the chair, and the other one will be supported by something like a yoga block. Yoga blocks are great because they're made of foam, but they're fairly stiff, so they're very light, they're very easy to transport, they're not super expensive, and if they fall over, they won't make any noise. That's always nice. So having a foot supported by a yoga block can work really well. One of the times that you might want tall heels, if you are a person who is comfortable in tall heels as part of your outfit, tall heels actually can work really well for this, because then you hook one heel around here and then the other one can actually be fully supported on the ground without you having to bring an extra piece of equipment like a yoga block, or without having to find places to have both feet connected to this stool. So those are all options. If you're going to sit on something that is this height, I find that the difficulty in that varies quite a bit depending on how tall the person is. So I've worked with students for whom they actually have to hop up to get onto a stool this size. For me, it's really close to my standing height, not very different. But I still need to be able to come up and over when I'm holding the instrument. So I am aware that in the thumbnail for this video I was not holding the bow in the way that bassists hold bows. Smaller instruments hold this way on the top, and bass bows are held generally at the side, and they have a big plastic piece that sticks down here, and so the strings, the hair of the bow, is actually several inches away from the stick that is on top, and they generally hold at the end. I just don't really have a good way to mime that because I don't have one of those in here right now. So they hold it more like this, and then this goes back and forth against the strings. So when they're doing that, that's a lot of movement, and it actually takes a good bit of pressure to get a clean sound out of strings that are that thick. So, not letting that level of bow pressure and the weight of that big bow drag you down. That's the first thing that I work with bassists on. After we've gone through fundamental basic movements, being able to sit on the stool without the instrument first, and then being able to start using the arms. If they're playing bowed bass, generally classical is mostly bowed, this weight of the arm shouldn't drag down the torso. So thinking up and out, 80 shoulder pads or an upwards V coming out from the low back, up and out the shoulders can be really helpful to be able to get that pressure that's needed without having it drag you down and tighten around like armpit to ribs area. Another thing to look at is spiraling. Bass players need to be able to spiral quite a lot in a different way than we talked about spiraling before with like violin, up and over to hold the instrument. That's a spiral around the spine. With bass, it's needed more as part of the tilt to be able to either pluck the string for pits, and most jazz bass is going to be done in that way. And then also to be able to reach high positions. The neck of this instrument, the strings of this instrument are so long that you have to be able to get this full range with a lot of consistency and accuracy, because the distance between each note is very far physically. So in order to get good pitch, you need to be able to get to that same place every single time really consistently. So if these are the strings of the instrument coming down, this motion is an interesting one to play around with. It can be really tempting to want to reach down with this shoulder. Problem is, your head is going to get in the way of the neck of the instrument pretty much immediately. So this is where I see a lot of bass players, especially ones who are playing consistent pizzicato, jazz bass, or are just playing a whole lot of really high stuff. They're really crunching in their torsos and really sending their necks forward to be able to look all the way down there at what's it doing down there. So a couple ways to work with this. If you're going to be sitting and playing, practicing this tilt up and over. And this is where I find being able to actually like hook the heel of a shoe around the edge of the stool very helpful. Because if you're trying to tilt forward, it's really easy to let your feet slip out from under you if they're not really well connected. So this tilt, along with being able to spiral like this, these are kind of the two motions that we're dealing with here. One is to get the right hand to the strings to pluck, and the other is to handle the neck of the instrument and the pitch. So to be able to do this around the neck of the instrument and the whole body of it coming around here, without taking the neck forward and making your spine do something that spines do not want to do, which is crunch forward on itself. So your vertebrae are stacked like a tower all the way up. And if you make a really big bend at the same place in that tower very consistently for hours a day, over decades, it will start to take pressure damage in ways that it would not, most likely, if that pressure wasn't there for that long of duration and frequency. And that's the reality of playing instruments, that you're in that same position for a really long time. So we need to make sure that that position that you're in is as healthy and sustainable as possible. Up and over, and then also allowing the instrument itself to rotate. And this is where it starts to really depend on the arm length of the player. I find that it frequently is a little bit easier for bass players who are standing to be able to reach the full extremes of the instrument pretty well. So in general, I like standing bass a little more than seated bass, but for like a 3-hour orchestra rehearsal, man, that's a long time to be standing there on this thing. So I totally understand like why you would use the stool. What this lets you do is reach in a different way and to pivot the foundation of the torso, which is the base of the pelvis. So when this whole thing can move around, it's so much easier to be able to get around this whole giant instrument because you're a lot more mobile when your seat is not stuck on a stool. One thing that I see a lot from very effective jazz bassists is rotating the instrument so they're almost playing it sideways because they're playing almost exclusively plucked. They're almost never bowing. And so they're here and the strings are facing this way. So this is the angle that they're dealing with there. And they can do it really quite effectively. If they need to bend, that can come a lot from the legs and the hip joints rather than trying to make that come from the spine. I will put a link in the description to a really cool video that is of it's in, the name of it is in French. I think it's the Orchestra of Contrabasses in French. And it's a whole ensemble of just basses, and they play some really cool music, and it's really interesting to look at from a field of like 8 or 9 orchestral bass players, which you almost never see all in one place. How are they all moving, and how are they doing it? Some of them do a lot of this, and they look uncomfortable, and I can tell you from experience that this is not as sustainable in terms of body mechanics as using the legs instead. So that's a great resource to check out and look at some of the options of how our really wonderful high-level players playing this stuff and being able to get comfortable doing this. So this bend is really key, and it's a very similar bend to what I'm actually doing when I'm seated on the stool, where my hip joints stay back, the pelvis stays back, and my knees are forward. Same thing. This kind of zigzag bend here keeps my weight really stable over my feet. So my knees are going forward, my head is going forward, and with this instrument, both arms are probably forward. Pelvis stays back. What we're trying to avoid here is pulling one of these where the pelvis gets in front of the shoulders. This is fatigue and back soreness waiting to happen. I'm already feeling it in my low back. The reason for that is this is asking my spine, my vertebrae, to crunch in on themselves and pull back and down. Right in there. So, coming up and over, move the base of this tower back. And you're going to end up with a lot more sustainable weight distribution. And my weight is still in the middle of my feet. I've got really good balance here. And if I go into a lunge, which I do recommend for bass players who are playing standing, this is going to be likely a left foot forward lunge around the instrument. Be able to do this. This is key to be able to get around and navigate this whole instrument. So, recap here for bass players. Checking in with how your shoes are interacting with the stool if you're using a stool. If you're not using a stool, being open to the idea of rotating the instrument if that works for you in the technique that you're doing. And check in with moving and bending more from the legs rather than your spine. And that will give you a lot more sustainable, healthy playing long term.